Hello and welcome. I am Thomas Porteus, and today we'll be diving into the complex history of US and Cuba relations, from early economic ties to the tensions of the Cuban Revolution and the 1960 diplomatic break. US-Cuba relations have spanned over 2 centuries, starting with early economic ties, evolving into conflict after the 1959 Cuban Revolution, and including a severe diplomatic break in 1960. A brief period of cooperation began with President Obama's efforts to ease tensions in 2015, but President Trump reversed many of those steps. Now, the Biden administration's recent decisions to lift certain sanctions and Cuba's plan to release prisoners signal a potential shift in the long-standing relationship. After over 50 years of tensions, US-Cuba relations are undergoing a significant change. The Biden administration has announced it will be removing Cuba from its state sponsor of terrorism list, easing sanctions and offering hope for future dialogue. Just hours after Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel pledged to release 553 prisoners, a move hailed by so many as a step towards reconciliation. However, the impact of these actions is uncertain, especially with the incoming Trump administration, which may reverse many of these measures. This shift in US-Cuba policy raises crucial questions about the future of the relationship and whether it can truly overcome decades of political and economic conflict. Thank you very much for joining us for this discussion. For this discussion, we are joined by our guest today, Raymond Vickery, former US Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Trade and Development, live from Washington. We are joined by Irina Schukerman, human rights and national security lawyer and editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider, live from New York. Patrick Payne, international affairs expert, live from New Delhi. Thank you very much for joining us all. Obviously, this is a relationship that has spanned for many years, and this terrorism list, Raymond Vickery, I wanted to come first to you on this. What does it mean to be on the state terrorism list? And what's the US's reason for removing it?
Well, thank you very much for having me. There's a whole list of disabilities that are imposed by being on the terrorism list in terms of the ability to deal with both publicly and privately with a government. So it's significant, and it is one that has been reserved for people who are actually spreading terrorism, that is, killing people for political reasons and the kind of car bombings and so forth that we've seen. Now, what has happened here, of course, is that Pope Francis has asked for this lifting as a part of the deal to be able to free over 500 political prisoners, as you indicate. There's widespread support for this move among many of the governments of Latin America as a goodwill wish and a goodwill measure during the Jubilee year of the Roman Catholic Church. So that is the wider context for the immediate action. Of course, looking beyond that, we've seen that over 60 years of sanctions against the Cuban regime, no matter how well-deserved, just simply have not worked in terms of furthering human rights, in terms of furthering the interest of the United States. And so President Obama tried to bring about a rapprochement between Cuba and the United States by lifting this. And when Trump came in for his first term, he reversed that, and largely on political grounds. There is a very large community of refugees and people who have ties to Cuba and Latin America in Florida, which has been a key state. And of course, it's very popular in Florida generally to be anti-Cuba. So that measure and reaching out by the Obama administration was reversed in the first Trump administration, and I have no doubt that this will be reversed as well. There are already signs that this will be made a major point by incoming Secretary of State Rubio, who has Cuban roots and has been very anti-Cuban. So there is both a international consequence, a consequence in terms of the release of prisoners, but broader considerations in terms of U.S.-India relations. But I think that what's going to happen, as I said, is that this isn't going to last long, and we'll be back to square one in relations between Cuba and the United States.
Irina Sukerman, I wanted to come to you on this next one. Cuba and the US, they are geographically so close together, but have a past of very complicated relations. How significant is this deal as a step towards normalizing said relations?
Much. Quite frankly, I don't think normalization is really in the works. First of all, Cuba needs the US a lot more than the other way around. Its economy has been mismanaged for decades. There's been attempts at reform. The Obama administration has lifted various types of sanctions to encourage privatization, economic development. It has not helped one bit because the government there is just too stagnant. Second, I'd like to note that nobody in Florida or anywhere else is anti-Cuba. They're anti-Cuban regime. They're anti-communist. They're anti-Cuba's mismanagement of the economy and human rights abuses. They're certainly anti-Cuba's relationships with China, Russia, and Iran, which have been driving the country's politics for decades. But they're not anti-Cuban, and I think no one in the U.S. wants anything more than to see Cuba free and prosperous and secure. But this is not a situation that we're talking about right now. And while it's very positive to push for the release of these prisoners, removing state sponsorship of terrorism is not the right way to do that. Unfortunately, there is a long history of the U.S. government covering up and understating Cuba's role in state sponsorship of terrorism, going back to the Soviet Union, where the Castro regime, more than anyone, had a role to play in Oswald's assassination of President Kennedy. We've been hearing all sorts of conspiracy theories blaming the assassination on everyone from the CIA to Ted Cruz's father, from Donald Trump. But the reality is, it was the Soviet Union and Castro who played a direct role in recruiting violent communist sympathizers and preparing them for attacks on U.S. targets.
Irina, sorry, can I just interrupt you there and ask you a follow-up question? Issues like human rights and political freedom in Cuba, they remain contentious. How can they be addressed?
They should be addressed. They should be addressed through targeted sanctions on Cuban officials who have a direct role to play in these abuses. They should be also addressed through positive assistance to human rights and civil society or organizations and activists in Cuba. But this is a separate issue from state sponsorship of terrorism, and it's not interchangeable to say that removing state sponsorship has any bearing on the human rights situation. It will not improve the situation overall. Just because Cuba is willing to release prisoners who shouldn't have been there in the first place does not mean that they will now stop their activities in furtherance of other regimes. Cuba has played a role as a mercenary for other countries in an economic role, entirely self-interested. We have heard from it from the numerous Cuban spies, very competent spies, who have been finally caught by US intelligence and revealed the extent Cuba has facilitated terrorism around the world by simply offering its services to other countries. Not the least of the latest of the scandals is the Havana syndrome, named that way for the weaponized attacks on US intelligence and diplomatic officers who underwent neurological attacks while being stationed initially in Cuba and then later all over the world and even in the United States. Investigations showed that Russians were behind a use of a weapon that led to these attacks. Likely the Chinese had a role to play. None of that could have happened without Cuban government acquiescing to this hunt for U.S. intelligence. And
Irina, I just want to stop you there quickly and revert this question to Patrick Rip-Payne. Cuba often has ties with countries that are often at odds with the US. You have relations with Russia, you have relations with China. How might this change its alignment?
Well, I think it's not a sin to have relationship with China or Russia, because United States is one of the biggest trading partner of China. So we need to come out of that, and it's not necessary that just because if the sanctions, I don't think the sanctions are going to go away. Biden should have otherwise, taken away the sanctions 4 years back, and not now after he has been, overwhelmingly defeated. So he, knowing well that Trump will come and completely do away with this decision, he is doing this optic. But let me put certain things very clearly. Number one, I think this is not an era of unilateral sanctions. Unilateral sanctions do not work, as Raymond rightly pointed out. There have been sanctions that the United States put on North Korea. What have we achieved as a world by doing that? It has only helped North Korea to remain more isolated, to actually empower the rulers even more, and they have the most sophisticated weapons. There have been sanctions on China. What has the United States achieved out of that? Today, it's such a powerful country. There were sanctions imposed on India as well once the nuclear weapon was detonated in 1998. And after that, Bill Clinton, as a president, came to India. Invariably the sanctions were lifted. So I think, it is always important to have dialogue. Even if you want a country to change the way it perceives the world, I think communication is very, very important. In fact, let me put it this way. Even when United States was in Afghanistan and the country was at war with Taliban, there were parallel talks that United States held with the Taliban in Doha. Am I wrong about that? So I think communication in today's era is very important. And that's why I think, I belong to a particular state in India which had a communist rule at one point of time. And so let me put it this way. I hate communism. I have absolute antipathy for communism. But at the same time, I still believe that just because a country is communist cannot be sanctioned. Please communicate, please talk. And I'm sure in today's era, if a small country like Cuba could survive in spite of such overwhelming sanctions, then it proves that sanctions have limitations in today's era. And at the same time, the whole issue of terrorism. Look, I am not an expert on Cuba-US relationship. If US has reasons to believe that Cuba has been involved and responsible for acts of terrorism, it has a right to take decisions. But at the same time, do we have a uniform policy, global policy on that? I mean, Canada, your immediate neighbor, America's immediate neighbor, has been sheltering, harboring all kinds of separatists who have waged terror attacks in India. I mean, when will the United States impose a sanction on Canada for harboring terrorists?
I wanted to move this conversation on to the obviously upcoming Trump administration, which starts on January the 20th. And I was wondering, Raymond, does Cuba's promise to gradually release 553 prisoners make this a deal politically viable for the US, especially with the upcoming inauguration of Donald Trump?
No. Trump is going to reverse this almost immediately, and it will have no lasting impact. It may actually hurt in terms of any kind of restraint on Trump, because it will inflame sections of the Latino American electorate who will view this as some sort of concession to the communist regime. I want to follow up on this business about sanctions. You know, India and most all the rest of the world do not have any kind of sanctions and have normal diplomatic relations with Cuba. That's one reason that these sanctions haven't worked. I think sanctions are useful sometimes as an alternative to war, but they aren't useful unless they are multilateral, unless there is a coalition which will actually bring pressure. And that hasn't been the case. We've tried for 60 years in the United States to go that route with little or no impact. So, you know, they say insanity, the definition of insanity is beating your head on a wall and continuing to do that and think it'll have some different kind of result. And that hasn't occurred. I think that this is, in a way, a courageous move by President Biden, but unfortunately, it's one which will have, in my judgment, very little impact.
Irina Sukerman, I was wondering, Cuban American voters in particularly Florida largely supported Trump in his previous elections. How would they react to this shift if it were to happen?
Well, we are seeing that even Cuban American Democrats in Florida are very concerned about this move. So I think a reversal of the sanctions would probably be welcomed by all of them. But let's be clear, if Trump is going to reverse the sanctions, it's not because he's so concerned about communism or because he's an idealist who believes in human rights and democracy. I don't think those issues are of particularly priority to his administration in this case. And we are seeing that Vietnam, an ally of the United States in many respects, also harbors an authoritarian communist-leaning ideology, but it's not under such sanctions. Why? Because it is not a danger to the United States. It seeks cooperation and it seeks to distance itself from some of the adversarial countries that the U.S. is concerned about. With Cuba, it's exactly the opposite. According to a Wall Street Journal report, China has tried to open a military base in Cuba. I've already mentioned Havana syndrome. I've mentioned that Cuban intelligence is playing a very negative role in Latin American politics with ties to Iran and Russia and also China. All of these things go contrary to Trump's concern about domestic security, about the potential for spies, terrorists, and criminals to cross into the United States. They line up with the U.S. concerns about Latin American security and the potential for adversarial actors to enter the sphere. So Cuba to U.S. is a threat, and it is quite correct that in the past U.S. failed significantly to restrain that threat by not publicizing its findings sufficiently and not working with the allies to impose sanctions on common security ground, highlighting the danger Cuban mercenaries play in the global context, highlighting how it facilitates Russian funding of its war in Ukraine and Iranian terrorism and Chinese expansionism and takeover of telecommunications and security of communications that's important not just for the US but its allies. That would be a way to encourage Europe and other countries to review their policies concerning Cuba. Talking only about human rights or economics is not going to cut it, and I think Trump would be wise to reorient the discourse in that pragmatic direction.
Patrick Payne, America has a long history of confronting leftist regimes in countries, in South American countries such as Venezuela and Nicaragua. Does removing Cuba from this list conflict with Trump's narrative on Latin America?
See, I strongly believe that in today's era, where there is such free flow of information, I think these isms have their limitations. I don't think hardcore communists exist today. I think some of these woke leftists are far more dangerous than the communists themselves. So far as Latin America is concerned, they have their own challenges. If you look at the Washington Consensus and what are the conditions that generally, IMF and World Bank imposes while they sanction loans, it's probably one of the reasons why many of them have thought of going towards the Chinese route. So I think in many ways, whether Latin America get influenced by this, I don't think that much would happen, though in any case, Trump will reverse it. But at the same time, it is extremely important for the Western, the Western polar of the world and the powerhouses to literally introspect as to why many countries today are thinking about BRICS, because they have this constant fear of sanctions, and many of the Latin American countries have the same concerns, primarily because dollar is a reserve currency and a trade currency. And at the same time, this is why I keep on reiterating, I don't think any of the Latin American countries today are interested in going back to communist era. Neither they are going to get influenced by Cuba. Cuba is literally completely, it is, I don't think it exists as a threat. Maybe a peripheral threat it might be, but I don't think Cuba is anything more than just a symbolic country. So I think how Latin America reacts to what happens henceforth depends a lot on how America deals with many of the templates it has used while dealing with the world. I think a little bit of change in that is required. And I think, just as if you look at the Indo-American relationship, it's a great relationship. There are many areas of convergence. There are areas of divergence and status quo as well. And we have been mature enough on both sides to respect that and equally go ahead with the relationship. I think many of the Latin American countries will look for that rather than thinking that just because Cuba has been, taken off the sanctions, they would be more interested in communism. They certainly would not. Back to you.
Raymond Vickery, staying on the topic of Latin America, could this deal help increase or reduce Cuban support for Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro?
I don't think it'll have any impact directly on the support that Cuba may be giving in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and so forth. Cuba has so many problems of its own, particularly has been pointed out by Arena that the economy is in shambles. But I do think that what is going to happen here is that this will fit within the Trump narrative of how the U.S. should deal with Latin America. He's already said that he would consider using force to take back the Panama Canal Zone. This is waving a red flag in front of many Latin American countries. But this will fit into that narrative, and the whole approach of the Trump administration will be one of confrontation in regard to sanctions, in regard to relations with Latin American neighbors. I mean, for example, he has invited Bolsonaro, the guy who was beaten in Brazil, to come to his inaugural. And he is going to push that old-time view, 19th century view, if you will, of what's in the interest of the United States and what makes the United States great, namely the control over other territories. That should not be the way of the 21st century. As Prime Minister Modi has said, this is not a time for war. This is a time to try to bring about peace and stability and economic growth as a measure of national greatness. That's not the Trump view. And unfortunately, I think that this is going to be just more grist for his mill, but will not improve U.S. relations with the rest of Latin America.
Irina Sukerman, this deal was obviously brokered by the Catholic Church. Now, we know that the majority of Americans are evangelical Christians, but how might the Catholic Church's role in brokering this deal be viewed by the Trump administration?
Quite frankly, I think a lot of the Republicans, and probably Trump himself, who may not be particularly religious, but understands the importance of religion for the American people and also in a global context, I think they are very concerned by the direction of the Catholic Church under Pope Francis. It is without exaggeration that to say that there was outrage over Pope Francis's handling of the issue of the Catholic Church in China, where he capitulated to the Communist Party's demands. And I think this brokering of this deal, while it may appear a kindness on humanitarian grounds, in reality is a security threat, because it unleashes a possibility of funding to a country whose intelligence is instrumental in empowering Maduro and has been the backbone of Maduro's own intelligence crawl around Latin America, and it will not prevent future arrests and rearrests and human rights abuses inside Cuba, because this is a one-time deal. It calls only for the release of those prisoners, but not for any comprehensive reforms in the human rights sector by the Cuban regime. Nothing will change. As a result, there will only be more incentive to continue things as they are. It is the fact that Pope Francis is linking humanitarian gestures to significant security-related provisions is extremely concerning. I don't believe that is the role of the church at all, and the fact that the Biden administration went along with it is going to also cause a lot of criticism from the religious circles who believe the role of the church should not be empowering evil regimes to do more harm.
Thank you all for joining us today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. That is all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more updates on the US-Cuba ties, as well as from other nations from across the world. Thank you very much for joining us.